Welcome back. In this video, I'll walk you through my Alla Prima approach to painting a portrait. I always start with a loose sketch to establish the composition. I mentioned in a previous video that I like to keep the draft loose, because as soon as color comes in, things naturally shift. The goal here isn't a hyper-detailed drawing, but rather a strong structure that will support the painting as it develops. I start by placing the top center of the forehead and the chin, setting up the vertical space. I break the face into rough thirds. About 1/3 down from the forehead is the brow ridge, another third down is the bottom of the nose, and the final third, between the nose and chin, is where the mouth sits. From there, I sketch in the shoulder line, then move to the arm and hand, keeping everything proportional to the head. Hands in particular can be tricky, so at this stage I treat them as simple shapes, almost like blocks, rather than getting lost in details too soon. Even though this is just a monotone draft, I'm already thinking about light and shadow. In this case, the light source is coming from the top right corner, which means I need to be mindful of where the shadows will fall. The areas where light terminates, like the side of the face opposite the light source, should have slightly darker, more defined lines to indicate form. Meanwhile, elements like cloth wrinkles and folds should remain loose, since they'll be shaped more through brushwork later on. With the sketch in place, it's time to block in the colors. When painting in oil, I like to start with the darkest values first, and that usually means the shadow side of the hair. This gives me an anchor point for the rest of the painting, helping me gauge the full range of values right from the start. Recently, I've been experimenting with watercolor portraits. You can check them out in my YouTube shorts, and the approach there is completely opposite. With watercolor, you have to work from light to dark, carefully layering transparent washes to build depth. But with oil paint, I can push the darks immediately, then gradually refine the midtones and highlights as I go. It's one of the reasons I love oil. It allows for so much depth and flexibility. When it comes to painting dark colors, I rarely use pure black. I mix crimson red and French ultramarine to create a deep blackish tone. If I want a warmer shadow, I lean more toward crimson. If I need it cooler, I add more ultramarine. Sometimes I'll mix in a bit of burnt umber to neutralize it. This way, even the darkest areas have subtle color shifts, preventing them from looking flat. I often get asked, what's the rule for brush strokes? There's no single right way, but I generally follow two principles. Either my strokes follow the form of the object, or they run perpendicular to the light source to emphasize contrast. For example, when painting hair, my strokes follow the natural flow of the strands, keeping them long and fluid to create a sense of movement. But on the face, the brush strokes are more controlled. They follow the underlying bone and muscle structure, helping to define the planes of the forehead, cheekbones, and jaw. This makes the features feel solid and three-dimensional. When I move to the clothing, fabric doesn't have the same rigid structure as a face, so my brush strokes become broader, looser, and more expressive. Sometimes I'll let them break apart, allowing the paint to create unexpected textures. This contrast, tight, structured brushwork on the face versus loose, energetic marks on the clothing, adds interest and variety to the painting. At this stage, I'm still thinking big picture, focusing on shapes and values rather than fine details. The goal of blocking in is to establish the overall light-color relationship, not to refine every feature just yet. That part will come later. Right now, it's all about laying the foundation with bold strokes. Getting flesh colors right isn't just about mixing a generic skin color. It's about understanding where the skin is thinner or thicker, cooler or warmer, and how light interacts with it. A big part of this comes down to what's happening underneath the skin. In areas where the skin sits directly over bone, like the wrist, there's very little muscle or fat, which makes the tone appear cooler. I might mix in more blue or a touch of green to subtly reflect that cooler temperature. But as I move up to the forearm, where muscles add more volume and warmth, I'll introduce a bit of cadmium red to bring in that natural flush. The same principle applies to the face. Areas like the cheeks, nose, and lips tend to have more blood flow, so they naturally appear warmer. But in areas where the skin is thinner, like around the jawline and temples, I'll lean towards cooler undertones. Thinking about these temperature shifts is what separates a flat-looking portrait from one that feels alive. Laying down the first layer of the background is a great way to define the contour line of the subject, especially along the light side of the face, where the edge is most visible. It helps me see the silhouette clearly and make adjustments if needed. I use a large bristle brush, which allows me to create a natural textured effect, especially when painting hair strands. Instead of meticulously rendering each hair, I can suggest movement and softness by dragging a partially loaded brush across the surface, letting the bristles break up the stroke. When mixing my background color, I also thin it down with a lot of solvent. There are a few reasons for this. First, it dries faster, allowing me to layer over it sooner. Second, the transparency creates a natural, organic texture. As the solvent spreads, it forms random variations on the surface. It's a great way to introduce an interesting visual effect without overworking the background. By establishing the background early, I'm also setting the stage for how the subject will interact with it. The edges where the portrait meets the background are just as important as the details within the face itself. Soft, blended edges can push areas into the distance, while sharper edges bring areas forward. So I stay mindful of where to keep things crisp and where to let them fade. At this point, the painting is starting to take shape, but it's still a work in progress. With the skin tones roughly placed and the background in, the next steps will be all about refining the values, edges, and transitions to bring everything together. In most portrait paintings, the eyes, nose, and mouth naturally become the focal points, so this is where I slow down and switch to a smaller brush to add more precise details. At this stage, I focus on defining edges. The upper lip, for example, often has a sharper transition at the edge, while the bridge of the nose is carefully softened to create a sense of volume. The eyelashes, though delicate, should have just enough definition to bring life to the gaze without becoming overdrawn. It's all about choosing which edges to emphasize and which to let blend subtly into the surrounding tones. One of the most fascinating things about studying master paintings in person is how they use paint thickness to enhance their portraits. If you ever visit a museum and look at a painting up close, you'll notice a pattern. The lighter areas always have thicker paint. When I visited the Prado Museum in Madrid to see Rembrandt's paintings in person, this became incredibly clear. In some of his works, the highlights are so thick that they physically stand out from the canvas, creating texture you can actually see from different angles. And there's a reason for this. Thicker paint reflects more light, making the highlights appear even brighter and more luminous. On the other hand, the shadow areas are often painted much thinner. Many beginner painters tend to fill in shadows with dark, muddy colors, thinking that darkness just means lowering the value. But in reality, shadows are more complex. They often contain subtle, high saturation colors that create a sense of depth and translucency. Next time you paint shadows, try thinning down the paint and introducing richer colors. Instead of defaulting to a dull grayish-brown, experiment with transparent layers of deep blues, purples, or even warm reds. You'll notice that the object feels more natural, as if the light is passing through the surface rather than just sitting on top of it. This contrast between thick, opaque highlights and thin, translucent shadows is something I keep in mind throughout the entire painting. It's a subtle but powerful way to add realism, depth, and a painterly quality to the piece. One last thing I always remind myself: the eye moves toward contrast. The sharper edges, thicker paint, and highest value shifts should all lead the viewer's gaze toward the focal point, which, in most cases, is the face. Everything else should gradually fade into softer transitions, letting the main subject shine. Now it's time to dive into the final details. The hair is where I like to pay special attention, especially the highlighted strands that fall under the light. Using a fine detail brush, I gently add those individual strands of hair that catch the light. This part is all about subtlety. You don't need to paint every single strand, but picking out a few key highlights helps bring texture and movement to the hair. I like to focus on the areas where the light hits most intensely, like the crown of the head or around the edges of the face. These are the areas where the light creates a beautiful contrast against the darker shadowed sections, and that's what gives the hair volume and depth. I hope this video gave you some useful insights. Let me know in the comments what's the hardest part of painting for you. And if you want more tips, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching and happy painting.